All right, thank you very much for the presentation, for the introduction, Meet. So, like Meet said, I'm Nuria Pelechano from the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya, located in Barcelona, Spain. And my talk today is going to be about virtual reality as a platform to understand human evacuation behavior. So I'm going to go a little bit over the work that I've been carrying on since I did my PhD and how we ended up at this point doing this kind of a work in virtual reality. So I'm currently, as I said, an associate professor at UPC, where I do my research in the visualization, virtual reality, and graphics interactions with a relatively large group of researchers working in different aspects of computer graphics, like computer animation, crowd simulation, virtual and augmented reality, realistic rendering, procedural modeling, geometric modeling, and management and rendering of very large models. I've got, our group is quite large. We have quite a lot of faculty members between associate professors and full professors, together with our researchers, postdocs, and research staff that we have in the lab, and many students that help us to do all this work, of course. So I'm going to start a little bit with the overall framework of the work I've done so far. So I started my early career years working on crowd simulation. And these involve different aspects like working on the local movement, how agents move from one point to another, how we can build navigation meshes so we have better simulation of those virtual humans, pathfinding, and also tools for authoring to ease the process of authoring crowds. And from here, we eventually moved to run experiments in virtual reality, initially to use virtual reality as a validation tool, but later on realizing that it could be a very valuable tool also to learn human behavior that we could then use to further improve our simulation models. And while going around this loop, you realize there's other aspects of humans that we also need to simulate in a realistic manner, that to achieve higher levels of realism so that the virtual experience is plausible. So we've also done some work on the animations, synthesizing animations for virtual crowds, and also working on the rendering and appearance of these virtual humans. So my beginnings, when I was doing my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, I had the opportunity to work there with the computer architecture department. And at the time, we did several technology transfer projects with large companies, large architecture firms in New York. And what we learned from this experience was what were all the limitations that existed in the software tools at the time that were in somehow limiting the power of these kind of simulations to really resemble realistic environments. So we had issues like, let me put the pointer here. So for example, we had issues like artificial blockages due to the bad alignment of the geometry, of the building geometry with the 2D grids that a lot of this software used. This is not a problem that existed only at the time. We can also see this in current techniques used in game engines, like recast, for example, that you might have inaccurate adjustments to the geometry. And this causes blockages that make virtual humanoids not be able to walk through certain portals that are technically large enough for them. And we could observe other problems like unnatural paths, again, due to this discretization of the space, or, for example, uneven use of staircases because all agents would plan the same routes based on shortest distance, for example, and not make a good use of the space of the available resources. So we realized at the time that we had to sort these problems, to fix these problems before we could really rely on the results of these evacuation models. So I've worked a little bit on the automatic generation of navigation meshes. I won't go into detail with this work, but I will leave the reference here if anybody's interested in looking through this work. Basically, what we wanted to have was a representation of the space that would accurately adjust to the geometry, would not leave gaps between bits of the geometry, would give us clear information about clearance, where agents could walk by and where they could not walk by, and then allow us to determine from which navigation cells to which navigation cells you could walk based on the slope or based on the step difference. So this is already a step forward to deal with continuous space, and to avoid agents getting stuck due to anomalies in the navigation mesh. So going back to how do we simulate virtual humans? So the first step would be how do we do the local movement? How do we get agents moving from one point to another, following smooth trajectories? What we knew very clearly from the beginning was that we needed to work with continuous space. We needed to move away from models that discretize the space, because that also limits the realism of the overall simulation. These agents had to avoid collision with other agents and with the geometry, of course. So at the time we worked, this was back at 2007, we worked on this HIDAC model for high-density autonomous crowds, which was a model that combined psychological and geometrical rules that were layered on top of the social forces model. So when we did this work, you had methods that work with rules, and the problem they had was they could not guarantee them that you will not have intersections, you will not have collisions between the agents. And then you had social forces models that were a very good representation of the agent's movement at the very low level, at the level of repulsion forces and frictions and so on and so forth. But you had agents that appeared to be blind, that they could not predict, they could not behave differently based on the environment. And we wanted to fix this. So we developed this model, where we combine different kinds of forces that would come from your desired direction of movement, the force towards the attractor, towards the point you wanted to move to, forces against walls, against obstacles, or against other agents. And the important thing here was these weights that you can see for each of these forces. So this was a weighted sum where these weights would determine how relevant one or another force would be. And those weights were modeled based on geometrical rules, perception rules, psychological factors, and that would allow us to give a variety of behaviors to our crowd simulator. And then on top of that, of course, at every step, you had to adjust the position of your agents, but keeping into account repulsion forces, reaction forces from other agents, so we could guarantee there'd be no overlapping between characters. So with this idea, we could simulate, we could model the different forces that were affecting an agent at any time, and model those weights based on, for instance, the distance to obstacles and agents. So forces would get stronger as you would get closer to an agent. Also, relative orientation of agents, because it's not an agent that is walking towards you. It's a more dangerous collision than an agent that is walking in front of you in your same direction. We had this perception area, so that agents would react to things that were in front of them and not behind them. We could consider, for example, the density of the crowd to determine how long this perception area would be. So, for instance, if you're in an environment with few people around you, you will plan your movements with more time, and your trajectory would thus be smoother. Whereas if you have a lot of density in front of you, you're going to react to immediate colliders. And we also incorporated this concept of right preference. So in the case of a frontal collision, if you were from Europe, for example, you would choose right preference, avoid on the right. If you're from Australia or England, you would do left preference, for example. So you could model a little bit even cultural aspects in this relatively simple model. So with this, we started achieving nice behaviors, like, for example, with this right preference, we had these flows that would emerge naturally, and people would tend to follow others in your same direction while avoiding the opposite traffic. And it gave quite natural representation of human movement. We also had the concept of pushing forces being modeled by different thresholds, so we could have more aggressive agents being able to push the crowds, while others would be more respectful, would wait and let others walk first. So with this, we could exhibit behaviors like panic and panic propagation, but also respectfully waiting in line, like you can see over here. So I'll show you a quick video of this initial simulator that we ran. This was my debug mode, where I could see how all these different rules were activated and deactivated so that different avoidance forces would be working at each time. The areas in front of an agent look for perceptual aspects or for waiting in line aspects. Here we can see the effect of panic propagating through the crowd. So people that had the ability to push others would just get through the crowd, while others would be waiting respectfully in line. And we could have other behaviors like different line widths based on, again, the weights assigned to the waiting timers, and to the strength of the agents when avoiding others. We had these braking forces so that even in this case of congestion, people would not push each other constantly. And I'll move a bit forward. We also included concepts like replanning trajectories, being impatient, and maybe avoiding a bottleneck if you knew an alternative exit. So all these things together gave us a quite nice variety of behavior, but at the time you had to model this system by touching parameters which were waiting radiuses, waiting timers, pushing forces, waiting rules, and things that were not straightforward for a non-expert user. So later on, we decided to once this model was finalized, we decided we could incorporate psychological aspects on top of this model that could allow a non-expert user to cause congestions and bottlenecks. So we evaluated this work through perceptual studies, showing results in a computer screen and asking people for their for how they perceive the crowd, what aspects of the crowd, what psychological aspects of the crowd they were perceiving. But then we thought it would be better if we could validate these models in virtual reality, where the person was immersed in this scenario, interacting with these virtual agents. And that's how we started. More than 10 years ago, we started to work on virtual reality. This work was still done at the University of Pennsylvania. So we simulated this virtual party. People would walk around. There was noise of people talking. People would gather around these cocktail tables, and they would do gestures so that it would give the feeling they were engaged in nonverbal communication. And the participant was wearing a head-mounted display. We can see in the back what this person was looking at. So we could study his behavior, his behavioral response inside this environment. And that's how we got our initial results in this area. So basically, we had the person being immersed in the virtual reality scenario, and we could observe things like if he would bump into a person, they would maybe step back, or if they saw somebody walking straight towards them, they would step sideways and avoid this person. It's important to notice that the participant was represented in the simulation by a virtual agent, so other agents would also avoid you in this simulation. So we saw how people adjusted the step distance, the velocity of their movements, and so on, based on the congestion, based on the density of the crowd around them. So the behavioral response of our participants allowed us to realize that they were experiencing high levels of presence in this environment, and thus they were responding in a realistic manner, to the point where in this example you can see, it's quite dark, but you can see that when a random avatar in the crowd appear to wave at the participant, some participants in an unconscious wave will wave back to the autonomous agent. So that was quite an interesting response. So this was very nice, very promising, but there were still way too many limitations when we did this first experiment. So the first one, we were dealing with a very high density crowd, and the first thing you are lacking is haptics. When somebody would push you, your virtual avatar would move away, but you would not feel anything on your body. And this could break presence a little bit. So this has been a limitation for many years. Now there's some research groups that are working into using vibrotactile sensors on the participant's body to try to give some haptics feedback. But the main problem at the time was the low resolution of the head-mounted displays, and the very small field of view. If you notice on those old head-mounted displays, you could still see the room around you, so they weren't fully immersive. You could still see the light, you could still see the person running the experiment. And then you had other issues like avatar's appearance and animation quality that I'll be talking about later on in this presentation. And the main thing was also the software at the time. Pretty much every experiment we wanted to run had to be implemented from scratch. There was not much reusability of code at the time to run this kind of experiments. So first results were promising, but it still needed to wait 10 plus years for the hardware and software to catch up. So then if you waited all this time, now we are at the stage where head-mounted displays are incredibly good in quality in terms of their resolution, the frame rate they can provide, the field of view. So the sense of immersion you have nowadays is much better than what we had at the time of those experiments. And also the software. Now, thanks to the development of game engines like Unity and Unreal, it's become quite straightforward to implement applications that can be run in real time with not much effort from the programming side. So for the next 10 years, I continue working on the different aspects of crowd simulation that could further improve the overall appearance of the crowd. So we worked on rendering, and we worked on synthesizing animation, so these people could be not just walking, but actually interacting with the environment somehow. So then when we had the right head-mounted displays and the right software to continue with the experiments in virtual reality, the first thing I wanted to test was to go back to our 2006 paper on crowd evacuation, where we did some interesting work about how having trained people in the crowd and having leaders in the crowd could improve the overall evacuation time. So we simulated this model where, based on the percentage of leaders and followers we would have in the crowd, the evacuation time would change. So we could study evacuation time, we could study congestion in different areas of the environment. We used the concept of communication so that people could exchange information about known areas of the environment so that they could help the evacuation process. And this is the first thing I wanted to revisit and test in virtual reality. So that's how we got to this point of my work, where we're studying human decision-making under stress in a virtual environment. So we modeled this train station where a participant had to walk through these main entrance doors at the bottom, and it would get instructions of what he was meant to do. First step was buy a ticket. So they'll walk to the ticket machine, get the ticket, and the next instruction would show up, being walk to a drinks machine. So the person would get used to the virtual environment, to walking around virtual agents, to notice how the virtual agents do perceive him or her and walk around them, and just get a glance of the station, realize where there could be other exits, for example. So we assign a sequence of tasks to guarantee that the person would have to walk through the entire train station, so that by the time the emergency will occur, the participant would be familiar with this environment. So we made him walk all the way to the trains. You could sometimes see people getting on and off the trains, and there were some trains arriving or leaving the station. We had people sitting on benches and then getting up and go to an exit, for example. So this last bit here, it's walking to a green machine, number 4, that had the purpose of making sure the participant would see this exit on the right-hand side. There's an exit to the street, which is obvious, it's very visible, and everybody had to walk in front of it. And then there's another exit that is very well hidden. And the moment the alarm goes off, which is right now, you see a flashing red light, you see a noise, an alarm noise, and some percentage of agents suddenly start running towards this hidden corridor at the very back of the station, walk on one condition, about 10 people on a second condition, and a bit over 10 people with a third condition. So first we checked presence, realism, and immersion, and we got really high levels of these aspects for all conditions of the experiment. So the interesting results are here. So what we can observe here is what was the participants' decisions in terms of exit choice, depending on the condition they experience. So the first case is alarm goes off and absolutely every virtual agent starts running towards this hidden exit F. And what we observe here is that almost all the crowd, except for one person, immediately started running or walking quickly, following the crowd. So under an emergency situation where everybody starts running, people would basically not take any decisions whatsoever.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
The middle part of this graph shows the case where half the crowd started running when the alarm went off, but the other half of the crowd continue with their whereabouts. So they continue with randomly assigned tasks within this environment, so going to the trains or going to a shop or sitting on a bench. So in this case, we noticed again that everybody exited through the hidden door, through the exit F. But the interesting thing here is this light blue section of the bar, which shows how many people would first walk to the main entrance doors, which is the one they knew because it was the doors that they walked to get in the station. So they first walked there and they found those gates to be locked. So when they saw the gates locked, they turned around, they saw some people running towards this exit, and they immediately just followed them. So what we can see here is that at least when not everybody started running, you start seeing some emergent behavior of trying to take your own decisions before following others. And the last condition was where nobody ran towards this exit. People just continue doing their randomly assigned tasks in the virtual environment. And in this case, we see the light colors represents that absolutely everybody went first to check the main gates that they knew. And when they found them locked, most of them started looking on their own and found the most obvious exit A, and left the train station through that exit. There was a small group of people, though, that still left through exit F. And we asked them after the experiment, and what they told us was that when they turned around after going to check the main doors, they noticed some people walking towards this hidden corridor. And even though they were not running, the fact that there was a few people walking in the exact same direction towards this apparently hidden space made them think that they probably knew where they were going and they probably knew an exit, and that's why they decided to follow them. So it's interesting to see how decision making is affected by what the rest of the crowd is doing. We did this experiment with like an evacuation drill with the alarm and the light and the noise. And then we did it with fire. And before that, we noticed one more element, which was that people that experience high levels of nervousness were those that tend to follow the others, whereas people that reported less levels of nervousness were those that found the exit on their own. And this happened exactly the same whether we had fire or we did not have fire in the environment. So why did we not see more stress, more nervousness, or maybe more agitated behavior with fire? We still don't know. We're still investigating this. One reason could be the fire was quite far away from the position where the participant was located when the emergency started. And also, it was not blocking their exit choice. But there's something probably more likely, which is the fact that the crowd behaved exactly the same in both scenarios. So maybe it is the crowd's behavior that affects your own behavior more than the situation you're observing in the environment. So what have we learned from this experiment is that people do tend to follow others, even in virtual reality, as long as we have high levels of presence. Under stress, most people won't decide on their own. And with low stress, people are more likely to explore the environment, to try on their own, to take their own decisions. And the main thing is that we probably need more expressive avatars. We need avatars that show emotions better than just running. And probably we need to work on better appearance and better animation. Those were at least the questions we had at the time. So in order to study these issues, we decided to run experiments where we had different appearance for the avatars and where we had avatars with exclusively locomotion, just walking, or with variety of animations, and see how this impacts the realism of the crowd simulation. So we had four conditions with one scenario that we then show from different viewpoints, where we use this bot-looking avatar or a humanoid-looking avatar, and we had different types of animation variety. So overall, we had two independent variables, the animation type and the appearance. So animation type could be locomotion only, so when the velocity of the agent will reduce or stop, the avatar will just stay in place doing nothing. Or animation variety, where we had people communicating through gestures, idle behaviors being played when the person was standing in a spot, maybe sitting down on a bench, and so on. And then appearance, we compare a humanoid appearance using the Rocketbox library from Microsoft, and we use just this bot avatar from Mixamo, just to have a very basic robot-like appearance. So we tested these four conditions in a within subjects experiment to see the differences in levels of realism for each of these conditions. So a simulation that the participants saw for this experiment was this one. They would see first the case of having simply bots walking in the environment. So you could observe odd behaviors, like, for example, when they would go they would stop in front of another person, they would not be interacting in any way, they would just stand still. When walking towards a bench, for example, they just stop there in front of the bench. Whereas when we used bots with animation variety, we saw robots sitting down, we saw robots using non-verbal gestures to communicate or give the appearance of communication with other virtual. But this happened in the middle of the massive COVID confinement, so that's why we moved the study to running it in the computer online. And we gathered data from a lot of participants. That was the good thing of the experiment, though. So I'll summarize the results. There was an interaction effect between animation type and appearance. So basically, combining humanoid appearance with animations, with variety of animations, gave significantly higher realism than any other condition that we tried, which is exactly what we expected. The animation for the case of bots, for example, the animation variety increased the realism, but it wasn't statistically significant, this difference. So we can only talk of a trend in this first experiment. We noticed also an interesting trend for the trajectories, which is that when the animations are exclusively locomotion, we actually got higher realism of the trajectories when using the robot appearance than when using humanoids. And this is important if you're going to use this kind of visualization to evaluate trajectories, because there could be an uncanny effect here on the humanoid appearance side. And finally, interesting, there was a statistically significant difference where for the case of trajectories, bots with animations were significantly higher than humanoids with locomotion only. So animation variety here, even for the bots, could give much better results in terms of the reality of the realism of the trajectories than having humanoids if they can only walk in the environment and they don't interact with the environment. So this was very interesting, and we want to test it in virtual reality next. But before that, I wanted to briefly introduce the concept of embodiment that we have been working on recently as well. It's basically when you put a head-mounted display on, and we saw it in the previous videos, you suddenly sense that represent other participants. And at the high-level decision-making for the crowd simulation, We can, of course, learn from the VR experience, but we've also been working on including real-world data to generate agendas for the people to do properly large crowd simulations that are realistic representations of the real world, and also including models maybe from neuroscience or cognitive science. So, for example, it would be ideal if we could get data from real cities about people's whereabouts, opening hours of restaurants and shops and schools and etc. What's the routine of people in the city on a typical day, and from that information, we're working on creating a framework that can get information from the real world and procedurally model behaviors for the entire population that we have in the virtual city. So this is our ultimate, or what we want to get at, is that with simple rule files that represent people's behavior and their interaction with the environment, and hopefully this information could be obtained from data that exists already in the real world. Cities nowadays are gathering a lot of details, a lot of data about the use of the space.
Nuria?
Yes?
I think we lost you for quite some time because
gosh.
of the connection. But that's all right. I mean, what we can do is you can continue, and then in the question and answers we can come back to those few slides, and you may just cover those that we lost. Is that all right?
Okay, so just briefly, any idea where you lost me?
Yes, there were two occasions that we lost you, but don't worry about the first one. The first one was a little bit brief, but the second one, I think, where you were, can you go a few slides up? I'll tell you.
Yeah, okay, I'll go up. You tell me what you don't recognize.
Yeah, go.
Espera. Yeah, just, okay.
Go one more up. No, go up. Sorry. Oh, yes, it was here. Yes, here. Where you were talking, I think, slide 35.
Yes? 35 is where you lost me.
Yes.
Okay, so what do you want me to do? I go quickly from
Maybe
here?
just quickly, yes, just quickly. You don't have to dwell as much time, but again, what I'm suggesting is, even if we lose you again, what I would suggest is we may come back to some of these in the question and answer time, if that's all right.
Okay, so I'll show them very briefly, just so people know
what
they're about, in case they want to ask questions.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that.
This is the fun part of virtual conferences.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Mead. Okay, I'll go back. Okay. That's okay. Okay. All right, so I will go very quickly. Basically, this is recent work we're doing on having a virtual representation of people's body so that they can better interact with the virtual environment and with the virtual agents. So basically, we're trying to get embodiment, which means self-location, being located inside the avatar, agency, have the virtual avatar moving exactly like you or as accurately as possible, and ownership, that means provide people with virtual avatars that are as close as possible to their real bodies. So we've worked on this platform. It's an asset we're planning to release for Unity, hopefully soon, where you can go in the virtual reality, get inside this virtual body, take some adjustments of the virtual body to better resemble your own dimensions, and then be able straight away to have this virtual body moving like you in virtual reality, so that when you are in the immersive experience and you look down, you actually have a body that represents you, gives you the feeling of being really there, and thus increasing presence. And this should be seen from a first-person perspective. So here, using a quick example of using transparency, we have the real person's movement and the virtual avatar. So we can see that it's not an exact match because we don't have a full mock-up suit on the participant. The idea is that with a few positional and orientation trackers and using inverse kinematics, we can have a accurate enough representation of your own body. So this is regarding embodiment in virtual reality. And now moving back to the original idea, which was replicating real human behavior for our crowd simulations. there's two aspects to work on. One would be, of course, improving the animation quality. But the second part that is more important is having decision-making for virtual crowds that better resemble human behavior. So one way of doing this is learning from virtual reality experiences. And all these things we learn about decision-making and stress affecting people's behavior, build models that are included in our crowd simulator. Also gather data from the real world, to get people with agendas, with things to do in the city, and maybe look at neuroscience research to also include aspects of human brain and human thinking. So this first experiment, this first work, I'll go quickly to the video. We're basically trying to create, in a procedural manner, large virtual cities with citizens that have agendas, that have things to do, things to plan, time slots applied for each of the things they have to do. The virtual city can be built from real-world data, so that we can have, for example, restaurants and groceries and workplaces and schools and so on, with real data about the number of people that fits in there, the opening hours, and so that way we can trigger the behavior of the individuals based on that information. I'm sorry. So we could also study from an urban planning point of view. We could plan, okay, what happens if I want to remove a park because we're going to build a new building? How is that going to affect the interaction of the citizens with the city? How could that affect, for example, aspects like mobility? So this is one direction of our recent work. It's gather data from that already exists, that is being already gathered by most city halls around the world, and include it in our simulator. So we have an overall behavior for the crowds that is more accurate. So we can, in this simulator, we can actually follow a person through the day and see that the person leaves home, takes kids to school, for example, then maybe goes to work for a certain number of hours, and then at the end of his or her work day, will go back to the same school to pick up the same two kids, and not two randomly assigned kids that have been statistically assigned, no? But it's actually connected to the environment and to the family members and to friends, so that the behaviors along the day make sense. So last but not least, looked at neuroscience and maybe cognitive science to get better models of how humans behave. So for example, this is a work we've done recently where we try to incorporate the aspect of how mammals, including humans, learn about the environment. So apparently we learn about the environment as we move around, neurons trigger in our brain that create this kind of hexagonal pattern. So basically that builds our memory and our orientation skills. So we've worked on, okay, what happens when we don't know the environment? Maybe we have to find some exploration algorithm, but it's not going to be a completely random exploration algorithm. It's going to be an algorithm that maybe considers the fact that humans have some vague orientation skill, that they will probably ask for directions to know in which is the most likely direction of movement to find their goal. And as they move through the environment, they build these mental maps. So then later on, we can go back to pathfinding. We can even go back to the A-star algorithm, but modifying the heuristic to incorporate this GPS of the brain theory, so that when searching for a path, we have into account this cell activation that can be represented as counters, for example, in an hexagonal navigation mesh. We're going to try to optimize our path, but humans are not really great at it. And we're going to use knowledge from cognitive science, such as people decide the direction of movement, and as long as they have good visibility, they tend to follow it. So once our virtual agents have picked a direction, we're going to try to follow it for a certain number of steps. So of course, not everything is black or white. So we're going to have to merge these two algorithms smoothly, going from full naive search, where agents need to walk around following some basic orientation skills that give them possible directions of movement, to the other end of this algorithm, which will be, they know the environment very well. They've got these cognitive maps represented as an hexagonal navigation mesh with counters representing how often they've been in that area of the environment. And we use this in the heuristics to choose paths that we're more familiar with. And that's how we can smoothly as we learn the environment, we go from left to right, we can improve our path in this virtual representation. So this is also going to allow us to simulate the trajectories of people that are very familiar with an environment, or tourists, for example, in a city where they're looking at maps, that they're not very sure where they're going, and they might be walking a bit in circles or going back and forth between different spots till they find the right direction. So with this, I will conclude my presentation. I hope you are still there. And I want to thank my research group with BIG at UPC and all the students and colleagues that have been working with me through these years or are working with me in this current research, and of course our funding from the Spanish government. And lately we're also participating in a large European project. So also the European Union for the an ITN network that we have at the moment. So